Milestone number 6 of closing your first deal is to prepare your investors for closing. Now you're just about ready to handle your investors and lender documents before closing your first real estate deal. You've completed milestone number 5, which you ordered the appraisal and instruct the attorney to draft the legal documents. Now you have to provide a lender with documents they request and prepare the investors for closing. It's getting close, very exciting. Before we get into closing logistics though, let's review the entity and SEC compliance documentation that your SEC attorney will create for you during this step. Now in milestone number 6, in just a little minute, we're going to cover the operating agreement, how to structure the LLC, securities laws, and the PPM. So stick around to the end where I share 2 simple steps to get investors' funds into escrow. Hey, I'm Michael Blanc. I'm a full-time entrepreneur, investor, and coach, and I'm passionate about helping others become financially free in 1 to 3 years by investing in real estate. Through my investment company, Nighthawk Equity, I control over $300 million of real estate, and I've helped my students acquire over 14,000 units at the time of this recording. So hit that subscribe button, smash the notification bell so you don't miss any more videos. We've got lots to cover. Let's do this. Let's talk about the operating agreement. In most cases, the attorney will advise you to create a limited liability company, which is an LLC, that will take actual title to the property. Now, the operating agreement is a legal document that governs who manages the company, how decisions are made, and how profits are distributed. The operating agreement can be a simple one-pager, or it could be dozens of pages long. A more complex operating agreement can define who can make what decisions, how these decisions are made, how people can be added or removed from the LLC, and other details. You can download and use sample operating agreements from the internet, but at the end of the day, you need to have a competent attorney create one for you, or at least review the one that you provide. Your attorney may charge you $500 or $1,500 for an operating agreement, depending on the complexity. Now, even though you might be the LLC's sole member, that's okay. The LLC is a separate entity from you, and the operating agreement defines how that entity is governed. A good operating agreement gives you credibility with others and provides a proper legal shield if necessary. Don't skimp on the step, pay your attorney. The operating agreement defines what decisions you and your investors can make and how these decisions are made. For example, do they require a majority vote? Does it need to be unanimous, supermajority, etc.? Now, it may define the roles and responsibilities of each of the officers as well. The agreement defines the ownership percentages of each of the members and how profits are to be distributed. It also defines other operational details, like when the end of the fiscal year is, when and where the annual member meeting will be, etc. Using your operating agreement, you can structure the LLC in several different ways. So here are some ideas, a list of several options from simple to more complex. Scenario number 1, you are the sole member of the LLC and have no investors. In this scenario, it's just you, right? And you're using your own money. Scenario number 2 is that you're the sole member of your LLC and you are borrowing money from investors. This is like scenario number 1, except that you're borrowing cash from investors who then get a promissory note secured against the building. By the way, this scenario is not very common when buying apartment buildings, just FYI, but it is an option. Scenario number 3 is that your LLC has multiple members. In this scenario, you're not borrowing money from your investors. Instead, your investors are contributing cash for a percentage of the company. You and the investors are all members with equal voting rights, and this structure may be appropriate if you're investing with a small number of friends and family members. Scenario number 4 is the LLC has investing members and managing members, so 2 classes. Now, typically, investing members are relatively passive, and the managing members make the majority of the decisions. This is the most common scenario for syndicated apartment building deals. Scenario number 5 is that the LLC has multiple classes of members. So Class A investing members, Class B investing members, and it can be even more. Now, this may be appropriate if you have one major investor who receives preferential voting rights, for example, and profit distributions over the Class B investing members. Using the operating agreement, you can give your investors no decision-making authority at all, making them purely silent investors, or you can give them more authority. This depends on what your investors want to feel comfortable with the deal. You can also use the operating agreement to define how additional capital can be added at a later time, or how investors' shares can be bought out if necessary. Now, don't worry too much if this sounds a bit complicated, because your attorney is going to ask you a bunch of questions. What do you want? And then from that, from your answers, we'll draft the operating agreement accordingly. Now, if you're worried about getting all of this right and are looking for a bit more support, we have programs, training programs, and other resources that will help you guide you along your journey doing your first deal in financial freedom. The best way to explore that with us is to book a call. Go to themichaelblanc.com/call and book a call and see what resources we have that might help you really accelerate your progress. Security law considerations. What do security laws have to do with buying apartment buildings with investor money? Well, here's the thing. When you accept funds from others to buy an apartment building, you're effectively selling shares, or also known as securities, in that entity in that LLC that will own the building. As such, because of securities, they fall under federal and state securities laws. Now, these laws differ by state and how complex of a deal you're putting together. Typically, you have to provide your investors with a disclosure document and file some forms with your state and or federal SEC. For example, if you have 5 investors and they're all from the same state investing in a specific apartment building in that same state, you may have no filing or disclosure requirements. On the other hand, if you're advertising to pool $5 million from investors across the country for assets maybe that have yet to be identified, then your disclosure and filing requirements are much more rigorous. Most likely, your situation will fall somewhere in the middle. You're not advertising to the public to find investors, but rather your investors come to you from word of mouth and prior relationships. You'll probably have less than 35 investors, and you're probably raising funds for a specific property you have under contract. For a scenario like this, it's not difficult to comply, but it will cost you extra money to do so because a securities attorney is going to have to advise you and prepare a lengthy 60 to 90 page what's called private placement memorandum, or PPM. Now, this can cost you $8,000 to $20,000 and even more depending on the size and the complexity of the transaction. The PPM is rather long. It's a disclosure document that's required to comply with these security laws. Hey, since you stuck around this far, appreciate it. Why don't you hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss another video when it comes out. Now, why would you want to issue a PPM to your investors? The primary purpose of the PPM is to disclose all potential risks to the investment to your investors and to ultimately protect you. If you don't issue a PPM and the deal goes bad, your investors could contact the state or federal Securities and Exchange Commission and file a complaint. The SEC may investigate the complaint. The first thing they'll check is if you've registered the proper disclosures. If you did, that usually ends the situation because you've complied with securities laws. If you didn't, though, they may prosecute and fine you. The non-compliance may also hurt you in court if the investors decide to sue you. So you have to weigh whether spending the $8,000 plus on a securities attorney makes sense. If you do it, if you can work it in the deal, you can sleep soundly at night, not having to worry about a potential SEC investigation. On the other hand, we as entrepreneurs always take well thought out calculated risks, and not issuing a PPM could be one of those calculated risks. Remember, we're not in the risk avoidance business anymore, we're in the risk management business. So if your investors are generally friends and family who will not likely become belligerent or sue you, even if the deal turns bad or if the building is smaller, you may want to forego the extra expense in the PPM. Ask your attorney and other investors for additional data points. But you must decide for yourself what level of risk you're comfortable with. In addition to the PPM, investors get what's called a subscription agreement. Let's call it SA for short. The purpose of the SA is for the investor to agree to the investment amount, acknowledge the receipt of the PPM, and make other disclosures required to comply with SEC regulations. Okay, now that we're on the same page regarding the entity and SEC related documents required for closing, here are some tips for getting your investors ready for closing and getting the funds wired into the escrow account. Okay, here are 2 simple steps you can use to get investor funds into escrow. Step 1 is to get the investors to review and sign the documents. Investors are normally busy people, and they're not going to have a ton of time or patience to read and sign a bunch of paperwork. Now, unfortunately, there are a ton of documents that should be reviewed by the investor, and some of them have to be signed. Now, I have found that some investors just sign when and where you want them to, and that's fine. Some give you comments, and a few actually call their attorneys to review the documents. It's imperative throughout the entire process that you communicate clearly what you want done and by when. Then remind people constantly and do whatever it takes to get it done. Normally, the attorney will have the operating agreement ready before the PPM, since the PPM incorporates the operating agreement. The operating agreement is the most critical document for the investor to review, since it's the contract between them, you, and the LLC. So give the investors several days to review the document and submit questions and comments. You've got to enforce your time limits by emailing reminders, if necessary by calling or texting the investors. Time is definitely of the essence. When you email the investors to review the operating agreement, what I normally do is I summarize the important terms of the document in plain English. Many times this is perfectly sufficient for the investor, and they may not even feel the need to review the entire document. In any event, it makes it easy for the investor to say yes and maybe even save some time. You want to make it as easy as possible to do business with you. The bottom line is this: the investors need to sign the operating agreement and the subscription agreement, but they don't have to sign the PPM. It would be good for them to read it. Step number 2 is to ensure the funds are wired on time for closing. Now you're almost on the finish line, okay, because your document's done. The last step is to email the wire transfer instructions to each of the investors. Again, give them a deadline, remind them of the deadline, and follow the funds are in the escrow account by the deadline. Now, as you can see, dealing with your investors can be a bit time-consuming process. You're going to find that some investors are very responsive, they follow instructions, they know how to use email, while others are not as compliant. And for them, you'll need to communicate frequently and be patient. Be sure to allow extra time for the stragglers. Now, while your investors are reviewing and signing documents, your SEC attorney is completing the necessary federal and state state SEC forms, which he will file at closing. Now, they will keep the signed documents in their attorney files. Okay, now hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss milestone number 7, which is closing your deal and cashing your check. Finally, let me know your thoughts or questions in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.